My talk for today is entitled Learning from the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and I want to tell you a couple of things before we get started. The first is that it didn't seem to work here to show photographs, but I do have a small album of photographs from my visit to Belfast last October up on Facebook. So if you use Facebook, just go to Terry Taylor here in Louisville, and I have a photo album that's called The Streets of Belfast. So again, Terry Taylor, Streets of Belfast. And if you look at it, if you wouldn't mind liking it, that tells all of your friends that it's there too, so if you would take a look. But also, as we're getting started today, I want to give you a little bit of a warning. This is one of the rare presentations that we have that is actually sort of R-rated. There's not going to be any sexual content, but I will be talking about some things and asking you to be thinking about some things in our own community that are fairly violent and fairly dramatic. So just a word of warning to people who may be a little bit squeamish about that. And as we're getting started today, I almost added the words Star Trek to the title of my presentation because that's actually where I want to start with all of this. I don't know how all of you are in your thinking about what happened in Northern Ireland and what we're going to be talking about as the Troubles, but you may know that Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland for decades killed each other in large numbers, and I never understood why. The Christians on both sides, this made no sense to me. And as I was trying to think about that and understand what this is all about and how crazy it all is, I was reminded of an episode of the original Star Trek program that aired, I looked it up today, on the 10th of January 1969, and the episode was called Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. And if you don't remember this at all, I'll tell you what this was about. It begins with two guys showing up on the transporter fighting with each other, and they have to separate them because they're about to kill each other. And each one of them is half black and half white. Black on one side, white on the other side. And they're trying to kill each other, and the people from the Enterprise, the spaceship, don't understand. Like, what are you fighting about? Why are you trying to kill each other? And one of them screams at them, "Can't you see?" It says, "See what?" The black and white issue. And they said, "Well, you're obviously black on one side and white on the other side. What's the issue?" "He's black on the right side. I'm black on the left side. Can't you see it?" I mean, it was just total nonsense. Of course, the point of the whole episode was the futility of fighting over things that seemed to make no sense. And in many ways, my perception of what had happened in Northern Ireland was kind of like that. But it took me going there to really get an understanding of what lays underneath what seems to be a battle between Catholics and Protestants, and ultimately the battle that goes on, the devastation, the violence, is really not as much about religion as it is about culture and ultimately about civil rights. So I was there the second half of October of last year, spent most of my time in Belfast, did visit the city of Londonderry. But as we're starting to talk about what happened there, I want to give you a little bit of historical background, but I also want to give you some language that's important to understand as we begin this process. There's the Catholic side and the Protestant side in all of this. On the Catholic side, the militants, the paramilitaries, are usually referred to as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And on the other side, the Protestant side, also paramilitary that was engaged in violence. There were a number of groups, but one of them is the UDF, the Ulster Defense Force. Also some language to keep in mind is we all know about wearing green on St. Patrick's Day in this country, but you need to know that especially in that country, first of all, they don't celebrate St. Patrick's Day in the way that we do, but there's a distinction between green and orange that's very important. Green is associated with the Catholic Irish side, most of which is with the Republic of Ireland, which is in the southern half of the country, or southern two-thirds of the country. Orange is associated with the Protestants. The reason for that is probably the genesis of this entire conflict is that Ireland, which is traditionally a Catholic country and never really thought of itself as associated with England or part of the UK, in the 1600s, 400 years ago, King William of Orange, they call him King Billy, defeated King James of England, who was Catholic. And this is a rallying point. Now, historically and geographically, just to get a picture of where this is all happening, I'm sure you know the island that includes England and Scotland. Ireland is slightly to the west of that, and where I was in Northern Ireland is in kind of the northeast corner of the island of Ireland, and is an area probably less than half the size of the state of Indiana. And the city of Belfast, Northern Ireland, is so close to the island that contains England and Scotland that on a clear day, if you're up on the mountain above Belfast, you can literally see Scotland across the way. So this all starts with the defeat of the Catholics in that part of the country by King William of Orange. Orange comes back again. And I should mention too, something that's going to come up is the idea of orange halls. There are lots of Catholic churches with their own community centers, but the Protestants are organized around kind of their cultural aspects, and they have things called orange halls, which I will mention later, and you should know that. But after this defeat, and around this time, the English and the Scottish begin to colonize the sort of, I think it's about 6 or 9 counties up in the northeastern part of the Irish island, an area that's roughly called Ulster, although there are 3 counties that are still part of the actual country of Ireland, which we'll talk about in a second. But this colonization begins, and so primarily Protestant people from England and Scotland begin to move into this area and are supported by the English with lots of money. And so they start moving in and kind of taking over the area that's been traditionally Catholic and traditionally poor. And there are many ways in which this story relates to the American Civil Rights Movement and the plight of blacks, especially slaves and former slaves in our own country. You might be interested to note that when the English and the Scots moved in, they started large farms that were referred to as plantations. Does that ring a bell? Okay, so as the story moves along, just historically, in the 19th century, the northeastern part of the Irish island is becoming industrialized, and you find that what is beginning to happen is with the industrialization, the economy of that part of the country is beginning to improve dramatically. The rest of Ireland is staying pretty poor, but what's happening also is that that economic development that's happening is happening primarily just with the Protestants who have control of things, and not with the Catholics. And also, late in the century, you're finding the Great Potato Famine, or I'm sure most of you know about that, and many people out-migrated from Ireland. But with this coming industrialization and the control of the Protestants of this part of the country, what happened was similar to what happened in the American South with blacks, especially post-slavery, in that because the Protestants controlled that part of the world economically and politically, Catholics were in essence shut out of jobs, housing, and especially the government. And to get an understanding of this, what we're talking about is that at that time, when all of this was beginning to happen, and especially well into the 20th century, in terms of government jobs, and we have many in our own city here, even if you had the equivalent of a PhD, probably the best job that you could get with the Belfast government or governments in that part of the country in Northern Ireland was sanitation worker. You were basically shut out of anything and everything. Also, housing is an issue there, and I think rental housing especially is much more common in that part of the world than it is here. You could not get decent housing. There were and have been literally generations of men on the Catholic side in Northern Ireland who have not been able to get gainful employment. And I know that this is still a problem in our own city, and especially in the west end of our city, where there are literally generations of men who can't find a way to get a job that will enable them to support their families. They were shut out of education, and the government was set up in a way in the early 20th century when some independence came, in a way that things were gerrymandered so that the Catholic part of the country and the population throughout the country literally could not pass a bill in their legislature, their parliament. Even down to the local level where there were Catholic enclaves, things were gerrymandered to a level that they couldn't even control their own local governments. So in the early part of the 20th century, there was an independence movement that arose, and around 1920 there's the creation of what's now called the Free State of Ireland, the Free Republic, in the southern part of the country, and Northern Ireland. But when all of that happened, the English government controlled basically what was happening in Northern Ireland. And so people get along fairly well over the decades, although they're dealing with essentially an oppressive situation in terms of politics and economics well into the 20th century. And then around the 1960s, there's a real heat up when people are really wanting to make sure that they have their rights. And again, much of this reflects what was happening in the United States with the civil rights movement. And when you talk to people in Northern Ireland, especially on the Catholic side, they reference that very quickly. There are similar marches there that go on in the way that there were marches here. And one of the most violent things that happened that really is a marker in the kind of explosion of violence that happened, especially in Belfast, is something called Bloody Sunday that actually happened in the city of Londonderry. And again, the tension about the involvement in England, London, of course, is an English city, and Londonderry is a kind of combined appellation for this one particular area. But I visited that city, and to this day, even though it's called Londonderry, no one on either side, no one calls it Londonderry. It is Derry. And I think that has to do with the difficulties that were there. But let me reference this particular event that happened that's called Bloody Sunday. As the Irish Catholics were trying to secure their rights to housing and government and jobs, etc., they decided to have a civil rights march. Again, in the same way that we saw happening in Birmingham. And I'm sure you all remember those images of the fire hoses and the dogs in Birmingham. And it's really kind of that experience in the United States with relation to the civil rights movement, by my understanding, that got the attention of people not only in the Deep South but around our country that just said this is not acceptable. Okay, so on this one particular Sunday in 1972, they're going to have a civil rights march, and they've been already told by their government leaders in the same way that people in Birmingham were told, you can't do this. They said, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to be peaceful. We're going to march. So they start marching through the town, and they're heading for a particular location. What they don't know is that the British are there with the military, and they are there to control the situation, and they haven't brought in the National Guard or the local police department. They've brought in the moral equivalent of our Navy SEALs. The most, empowered, the most trained to be violent, etc., in what's happening. And so as these walkers are moving through the city, they had already decided that they were only going to let them get so far. And there's actually a strange thing that was going to happen where they were going to break through a wall with a tank and stop the whole thing. And then somebody pointed out to them the other side of the wall from where they were to do the surprise was like this big dip, sort of like a moat. So you go through the wall, the tank's going down in the hole, you can't do that. But at some point, the military confronts everybody, and in the same way that things happened at Kent State here, they open fire. Many people are killed, many people are wounded. They're unarmed, and this goes on for decades. And right after this happened, in the same way that we saw things change dramatically in the civil rights movement in the United States, the leader of this peaceful movement, who himself was actually Protestant, there was a press conference, and he said, today more than any other day, they have empowered the IRA. We're in for a bloodbath. And they were. And so from that point on, things just explode. And over the next 3 decades, over 3,000 people are killed, either through assassinations or bombings in local shops. Things get completely out of control until about the 1980s, when there began to be conversations between people like Margaret Thatcher, who was actually adamantly opposed to any conversation with the people on the Catholic side in all of this. But things trail out over a period of decades to the point that finally in 1998 there is something that happens that's called the Good Friday Accord. And I was thinking about this morning. It's kind of interesting and odd that we are gathered today on the eve of Good Friday here. But things had been going very badly, and George Mitchell, who is a former U.S. Senator from the United States, but somebody who was a powerful peacemaker and mediator, brought people on all sides, not just Catholics and Protestants, but the British and everyone else, together. And they finally reached an initial accord that tended to stop the violence. The IRA made a commitment to lay down its weapons. It took a while for this all really to happen. And by being there, everything that we see in the United States says that it's the Good Friday Accord that brings peace to Northern Ireland. It's actually not. That's the first step. But when you get there, you find out that it takes another 10 years for things really to get settled out and for the Irish to have their own parliament and to bring a relative peace to their streets, but at a level that, as I talk to people, I was reminded of a conversation that I had with the retired Anglican primate of Sri Lanka. This was several years ago, and you may know that there was a civil war that happened there. And I asked him how things were in his country, and he said to me, the war is over, but we don't yet have peace. And that's probably true in Northern Ireland. There's still a good bit of tension, and I'll talk in a second about some of the issues that remain. But they have brought people together. They have their own independent parliament. But something that's intriguing to me, I visited their parliament and I met with a member of Sinn Féin, which is the political arm of the IRA, and also with somebody from the Protestant side in their parliament. And you should know that, and I don't think we've ever had anything like this in the United States, but their government is set up in such a way that the leadership of parliament is actually referred to as a diarchy. There is a first minister and a second minister, so like the prime minister and deputy prime minister. The prime minister is of essentially the Protestant party. The second minister is from Sinn Féin, the Catholic party. But when I met with Barry McElduff, who is a member of Sinn Féin and one of those backslapping Irish storytellers, just a crazy funny guy, he told me that even though you've got first minister and second minister, that doesn't really reflect what's going on. They're basically co-prime ministers. And he said to me that Sinn Féin, which had been shut out of government basically forever, he said, the first minister can't order a pizza without checking with us. So we have to do all these things together. But there is still tension. And so I met with Barry McElduff. And then later in the afternoon, I met with, the first minister was out of town and wasn't available to speak, but his top advisor took time to meet with me and sat down with me for about 2 hours, and we talked through many of the things that had happened in that country. And I asked him what he thought was going to take for there finally to be a genuine peace in Northern Ireland. And he was a very, very kind and thoughtful guy, and I was really surprised that he was so honest about this, but he said, what's going to happen is that this generation, meaning my generation, is going to have to die out because they feel so much pain about things that they still have deep, deep hurt feelings. And what remains today, that most of the violence has stopped. There are still riots that happen every year, but the shootings, the bombings, for the most part, have stopped. But I'll tell you what they fight over now, and this may surprise you. They fight over flags and marches, and they fight tooth and nail over flags and marches. The flag issue, Northern Ireland is part of the UK. It aligns with Britain, with a sizable Catholic population that actually aligns itself with the Free Republic of Ireland in the south. And up until just recently, the Northern Ireland government over its parliament buildings had flown the Union Jack, the British flag, all the time. That doesn't happen in other parts of the UK. And so the Catholics saw that as an infringement of who they were and their rights. So they fought about this for a long time. And so finally, a third party, literally a third political party, came up with a suggested solution, which was, and this is apparently what happens in Canada and other parts of the UK, that on the birthday of the Queen and other significant members of the royal family, they fly the Union Jack in the same way that they would alongside the Canadian flag. So now in Belfast, Northern Ireland, they fly the Northern Ireland flag, and on selected holidays, they fly the Union Jack. Well, this really upsets the Northern Ireland Protestants, so they still struggle over this and have issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that would mean in our own country in a second. But also marches. Every summer, the hurt of this goes back so far that there are a number of marches, but in particular there is a march in the summer, I think in July, on the anniversary of King Billy defeating King James in the Battle of the Boyne. And they've had this march literally for centuries, but neighborhoods change, and this now takes them through Catholic neighborhoods. And they fly flags in a way that is really unacceptable to people, so they really struggle over all of this. And one last thing about that, and then I'm going to bring things around and try to put this in the context of what this would mean if we were doing this in Louisville. While I was there, one of my hosts took me to an area that was similar to what we had when we had Occupy Louisville. You remember when there was an encampment here? Well, there's an ongoing encampment on something called the Shankill Road, which is the main Protestant road. And they're there, and for the most part, they're peaceful, and they pass out flyers and their rules and things. But they interact with the police. And the police now are not British police. They are from Northern Ireland, but still there's tension over things. And while I was there, there was something going on, and I honestly don't remember what it was, and it's back to the sort of Star Trek story of what this was about and why this was so important. I don't understand, but the people at that encampment were so unhappy about this that the word passed not to give a cup of coffee, sell a donut or a bagel, or I don't know what the Irish eat for breakfast, bangers, nothing to the police on that street, nothing. And my host, who was from the Protestant side, aligned with this encampment, I said to him, okay, so what happens if there's a coffee shop and a policeman walks in and orders a cup of coffee and they sell him one? And he said, they'll burn your shop down. They're not kidding. I mean, this is how tense things still are. So, this is now going to be the R-rated part of my little presentation to you, and then I'll be happy to take questions and hear from you, your comments about things. But let's think of that happening in our own community. First of all, Belfast, which is a major world capital, interestingly, is only half the size of Louisville. So first of all, in terms of what happened there, and with the Troubles which extended from the 1960s up through the 1990s, 3,000 people were killed there. That would mean 6,000 people in our own community. Think about that for a moment. Just think of 6,000 people being killed in our streets in political strife since about 1968. That might mean something to you. In our own community too, think of, and I'm trying to think of a way to do this so it's not offensive to Republicans or Democrats in our own community. So in your own mind, pick one or the other. It doesn't really make any difference. But think of our community as though one political party or the other has been in power since 1920 and have set things up so that nobody from the other side on any issue, question, or problem that they have is able to get a bill introduced or passed in our city council. Not one. Think of our government as set up in a way that there are many government jobs here. You can think about them, and you probably know many people involved. That let's say, and I'll go back and forth on these things, let's say the Republicans are in charge, so no Democrat, if they see that you're a Democrat anywhere, that you're registered to vote that way, you can't get a job with the city above the level of sanitation worker. They don't care if you have a PhD, hundreds of years in your family of experience in government work, they don't care. You're just out. We have public housing here. You can't be a part of public housing. You can't get a subsidy for anything, etc. I mean, you're just absolutely shut out. Educationally, there are public schools here. You are automatically shunted, and now let's switch it from Democrats are in charge to Republicans in charge. The Democrats say if you're a registered Republican, there is no way that you can go to one of the better schools in our city. You have to go to, like, they would literally shunt you to whatever is the least attractive, least successful school in our community. Let's take it a step deeper. And this is where it gets to be a little bit touchy. I want to ask you to go through an exercise with me for a second that may be a little bit distasteful. But I want you to shut your eyes for a second. Everybody shut your eyes. Think of your favorite restaurant on Bardstown Road. Now, picture that in 1972 somebody walks in and leaves behind a bomb that kills everybody in your favorite restaurant, including friends of yours and relatives of yours. And how would you feel about that, and what would you want to do coming out of that? Now keep your eyes closed for a second. And think about Frankfurt Avenue. And let's shift it this time to a coffee shop. Think of a coffee shop maybe that you go to on Frankfurt Avenue. And it's now 1985. somebody walks into that coffee shop and puts down a bomb and walks out and kills 25 people, again, many of whom are your friends and your relatives. How would you feel about that, and what would you want to do about that? So you can open your eyes for a second now. But another way of thinking about this in our own community is with relation to community leaders. The killings and bombings in Northern Ireland frequently took out community leaders who were either assassinated or disappeared. We know that word in our own Western Hemisphere from things that happened primarily in Latin America. But over the years, hundreds of community leaders were disappeared. So again, I would encourage you, look around the room. Look at people that you know here. Look at peacemakers in our midst. Think about, over the years, maybe half the people in this room either shot down or simply taken away and never heard from again. What would that mean to you? And what would you want to do about that? That's what they've been facing there over the years, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. But there is hope in all of this, as I said. People are working together, but it's going to take some hard work still to get this to change. And sadly, as somebody said, it may not actually change until a whole generation of people have moved on and they've had some kind of even a tense peace for a while. But I want to finish this with talking to you about a couple of things that I learned and I hope have brought back here. And I want to preface this by saying that I have no thought that I have anything to say to the Irish about how to solve their problems. Their problems continue, and they've been at this for years, and they'll figure this out. But while I was there, one evening there was a memorial walk commemorating a terrible bombing that had happened on the Shankill Road, which is the main Protestant road there, 20 years to the day earlier. And there were actually 3 days of activities commemorating this, and I was just part of a march. And about 500 people came, and we actually marched up the Shankill Road, and we stopped at 4 different places where there had been bombings over the years. At each place we stopped, there was a reading of the names of those who had been killed. There were prayers, there were songs, but in no case was there ever any word about where we go from here. How do we bring peace? How do we make sure that nothing like this ever happens to Protestant children or Catholic children in the future? And that actually stunned me. And one other thing, this is just sort of a side comment about this event. I tell people I sometimes go places that are dangerous or potentially dangerous, not intentionally that I want to get hurt, but if you're not going someplace where things are really happening, you're really not necessarily honest about all of this. So after the whole event was over the next day, I asked one of my Protestant friends who was part of the march, did you have any fear that there might be a bombing during that commemoration? And he said, not for an instant. He said, because we knew and they know that if they did that, that's basically the nuclear option. That would mean all-out war between the two sides. So I don't think that that would ever happen. But I have to tell you, when I was walking with those people that night, I just did think in the back of my mind, I wonder if there's somebody here with a weapon or something. I hope not. But what this said to me was that if we're going to ever find anything that's a solution to violence, we have to be thinking about the future. We need to honor the terrible things that have happened in the memory of that and the people who died, but we have to make a commitment to working toward the future. And as I came back to Louisville, you may be aware that our dear friend Christopher Tuax, who is sitting here with us today, our guest, is working in our own community to try to reduce violence. And I had already been working with Chris, and he would let me from time to time be present when there was what I call a roadside memorial. You may be aware of these things that happen when there's been a terrible shooting or something in our community. On the anniversary of the death, the extended family will gather to mourn what had happened, and oftentimes there are 50, 60, 75 people who show up. So I came to Chris, who's already doing wonderful things, and I want to acknowledge that, but just to say, as we're doing this, could we add in an element not only of memorializing, but asking people to make a commitment to work to reduce violence, and also to take a vow of nonviolence? And he very graciously said yes to that. And as part of that, we're starting this process, and we were just talking before things started today that there are some things coming up at which we're going to be doing even more of this. But we did at least one memorial already, and some of you may have been present a couple of weeks ago when, in reaction to what had happened on the Big Four Bridge and other places in our community, we did what is now, I'm thinking, the concluding memorial event about that, and we asked everybody to take a vow of nonviolence. And this might sound minor to you, but I think people standing in public and speaking those words and making that commitment can have a profound effect. And as we're gathered today, as kind of the last thing before we move on to questions and answers, I would like to invite you, you should have a copy on your table of the vow of nonviolence. And I'm going to start saying this, but if you've got a printed copy in front of you, if you would join me in taking this vow if you are so inclined, and take this seriously. And I would encourage you to take this home and put this up someplace at your house or at where you work or your school, where you're going to look at it every day and remind yourself of what this is all about. So here we go. I vow, if you join me, I vow that throughout the year 2014, I will strive to live a life of nonviolence by striving to show compassion and forgiveness to everyone, not using violent words that harm or humiliate others, refusing to bully anyone or allow anyone to be bullied, not using physical violence of any kind, refusing to fight back even if I'm provoked, putting down guns or any other weapons I may possess, and encouraging others to be nonviolent. So sign that, date it, and put it up and look at it every day and remind yourself of what that's about. And having said that, I think most of you know who John Deere is, a great peacemaker in our own country who's a friend of mine. And we were talking one day about vows of nonviolence, and he said to me that he and other people that he knows at that level fail in this. There are going to be times when you say things you regret or do things that you regret, but he says just pick yourself back up, recommit, and move on. So it's not something that's going to last forever, but strive to be nonviolent in what you do. And if you'll send us a note or go to Chris's website, we're going to add you to a group where you're going to be getting updates about what's going on in our community and events that you might want to attend. And one last thing, since Chris is here, we're doing a project that we call Community Violence Reduction, and we've made bumper stickers that go with this. And we have a stack of these at the back of the room. And I want to invite you to do something that will show your support for Chris and what he's doing. If you'll make a donation of $5 or more as you go out, pick up a bumper sticker, all of that money is going to go into supporting Chris and what he's doing in our community with young people to try to reduce violence. So, thank you, Chris. So, that's all I have to say about this stuff, but would be open to questions and comments from people, and especially about the connection between what happened in Northern Ireland and what's happening here. Chris?
I was just fascinated in the way that you took us through the exercise of closing our eyes, and it brought me to a kind of real connection with things that we don't think about sometimes. In other words, what would it be like to be sitting in a restaurant, Bardstown Road, or a coffee shop on Frankfurt Avenue, and the horrible situation that could manifest out of anger and rage in a person. And then a bomb goes off. You know, we've been very fortunate we don't have that kind of daily activity. Whether Northern Ireland, the Middle East, or anywhere else. But again, that's a powerful exercise. I'm glad you shared it with us, because now I'm going to copycat it and use it with somebody you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Glad to hear that that resonated with you. And you know, in that, I intentionally, when I said that, asked you how you would feel about that, because what was happening there is, if you think about this, think of, you know, like your nephew, your daughter, your son being blown up or maimed. You come out of that, you're going to be incredibly angry. Incredibly angry. But what do you do with that? And unfortunately there, and this happens in our own country too, people take that and just lash out at the other side. So it's this perpetual cycle of revenge until somebody finally has the courage, like Gandhi or someone else, to say, this ain't working, we got to stop this. And there it's taken decades, but just imagine if this were going on in our own community. And we have not something quite as bad, but in our own community.
Yeah, quick follow-up. You know, that's what I think a lot of people don't realize sometimes, is that there are a lot of revenge shootings in this community. And it's kind of like the Northern Ireland bombings or the Mideast bombings that, like Terry said, what do you think about? I just lost my nephew, I lost my daughter, I lost my niece to this horrible act. And the first thing in my mind is I've got to embody that same anger and rage, so I need to commit the same act. Not everybody would think like that, but this is what these kind of acts kind of encourage. And what peacemakers have to do, in my opinion, is equally, with a lot of vigor, encourage an emotional reaction that causes you all to, causes a person, excuse me, to think in a more rational way of, how can I promote the peace angle to this as a response to this violent, horrible act? Because that urge of wanting to, seek revenge is real. But good individuals of goodwill have to have a mindset that's tough as steel to actually just tell the people that they're connected to that, yes, there's a lot of pain that's been inflicted here, but the bottom line is the best rational response is the peace response, because it has more power over the hate.
Yeah, and if I could just add a word to what Chris just said, I'm reminded when I was a kid, I was already against the death penalty when I was about 10 years old, and my dad was a good old boy and all in favor of the death penalty, and as a matter of fact was present for the last public hanging that happened in the United States in Owensboro, Kentucky in the 1930s. But I remember him arguing with me and saying, look, you're grown up and you've got a wife and kids, and somebody breaks in and murders your wife and kids. Are you telling me you don't want that person to fry? And I didn't know what to say to that at first, but I finally realized that the honest answer is yes, but it's not right. I mean, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
So you have to get past that, feel it. I mean, it's certainly real. It's dishonest to say you wouldn't be incredibly angry, but the best solution is to try to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen to anybody else. And that's what I think Chris is doing too. So, question back here.
What is the numerical balance between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland? Are there fair elections? And then, given the example of Northern Ireland, why hasn't the West Side of Louisville been off to march at St. Matthew's? It seems like it would have been an appropriate response.
Well, I might ask Chris to respond to the second part of that question, but the first part was, what's the current numerical breakdown in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics? Is that correct? I think it's still about 60%, maybe 70% Protestant and about 30 or 40% Catholic, but the population of Catholics is growing, and in the same way that we're seeing things transform in our own country where minorities are becoming majorities in control in some sense, it is changing that way, and especially in their legislatures. Still, the Protestants can, in some sense, don't really have control of the parliament, but are the more significant group there. And there's a third party that's not associated with either religion that has maybe 15 or 20% of the vote in their parliament that is trying hard to work as a kind of mediator between the sides. There's still a lot of tension. As I said when I went on that march, I didn't say this, but I probably should. Something that struck me too was there was not, to my knowledge, one Catholic person at that memorial march. 500 or 600 people, not one person. And the same thing happens on the other side when they do their commemorations of things that happened. And there are some people who are trying to work to bring people together, including the Quakers who are there. They do some things, but they told me a story that they're bringing women who are in danger of losing their children, so they're doing some education stuff with them. And it's people from the Protestant side and the Catholic side. You'll love this. Their facility is up on the mountainside. There are separate roads that will take you up there from the Catholic side and the Protestant side. And they were having a meeting with these women one day, and somebody who was Protestant said something about, what exactly is a Mass? I hear that all the time. You don't know what a Mass is? No. The Protestants had never been in a Catholic church. So they took them, Quakers kind of stand in the middle, took them down so that everybody could experience what a Mass is like. But they're almost completely separated. They just don't interact. And our goal at Interfaith Paths to Peace is trying to bring people together to understand each other better, because we believe that when that happens, it diffuses the violence and the anger that's there. So I think that that could happen. And do you want to repeat the second part that relates to the West End and St. Matthews? And Chris, would you repeat that?
Based on the example from Northern Ireland, it would seem to me that the poor folks in West Louisville might choose to go march to more affluent parts. So, better social justice.
Excellent idea, however. Excellent idea. He was just saying, based on the examples of Northern Ireland, that it seems like those individuals who are embedded in some of the very violent and turbulent pockets of West Louisville would want to march on some of the affluent neighborhoods in the East End to let them know about their dissatisfaction with what I think he's saying is kind of not an adequate response to the problem, especially since we merged, which has been about 11 years now, since January of 2003, April 2004. Since we've had our merged government, our numbers are very, very disappointing in the sense of 700 plus criminal homicides, and here's a bigger number that I think the public really doesn't get. Over 2,000 intentional gunshot wound victims in the city. These are people that have been wounded, and if it wasn't for a bad shoot, if you will, by the perpetrator, or if it wasn't for good doctoring now in trauma, with the trauma surgeons, and a lot of heavenly luck, our homicidal rate could be off the chart on a yearly basis with over 100 plus a year, and that would be even more alarming than the usual 50 or 60 individuals. But to put it in perspective, I think equally as it relates to these hot pockets in the West End, there has been a complacent kind of mindset that has simmered into the neighborhoods where the ponies, to kind of phrase this expression, the ponies have constantly been leading the horses. With that said, we need an effort from the horses to start leading the ponies again internally. And then maybe we can reach out externally to say, now we're showing a heck of an example of grown-ups, to ask other grown-ups to get on board and join us, because now y'all can see that we're not afraid anymore, and now we can use this extended help in some kind of way because we're doing some real things. Until that materializes, people from afar will look at this as like, I don't really see the grown-ups stepping up to address this problem in any significant way. It's a sad note, so I'm not trying to evade your question. That's probably why you don't see this kind of encouraging sign of why we should be, you know, really rattling our little sabers to say, people in the East End, look at our problem and you're not helping. Equally, internally, we've got to show example by the internal help that's really needed too. And that's not totally materializing yet.
And if I can add a quick word to that, you may know the story that Emerson went to see Thoreau when he was in jail for one of his civil disobedience acts, and looked at Thoreau behind the bars and said, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" And Henry looked at him and said, "Ralph, what are you doing out there? Why aren't you in here with me?" And maybe a better question almost might be, why aren't people from this end marching with people in the West End? And I'm reminded of, we were just talking a second ago, that when the Dalai Lama was here last year, Chris organized a walk for compassion in the West End, and 500 people, maybe more than that, came out, and some of us went and walked with him. He invited us to do that. And this is a both sweet and sad comment, but Councilwoman Attica Scott was there, and I spoke for a second, and then she got up to the microphone and said, "Friends from our neighborhood, look around you. For the first time today, there are white people walking with us." Well, first, it's good that white people are there finally, but the other part of that is, where have you been? Like, why aren't we here? Why aren't we, when violence is happening, why aren't we there working? So I think that the broad invitation is maybe more, what more can we do to go and be supportive of what Chris and other people in the West End are doing, and also in other parts of our city, the South End, and any place there's trouble. So anyway, and question back here?
Yes, I would just like to comment on why black people might not be coming to the East End.
I honestly can't hear. Could you say louder?
Oh, I'm sorry. I would just like to add a comment about why black people aren't coming to the East End. 12 years ago, during the community conversations on race relations, I heard So they're not gonna go to the East End
That's
and
challenging.
protest because they don't think they're gonna listen any more than they do now. But I would like to ask, since the violence has been reduced in Northern Ireland between these two groups, has the social justice and community sharing increased, or is it still prejudicial?
I think a good bit of the prejudice is gone, at least the institutional kind of prejudice that we saw before. That's basically against the law now. They can't do those things anymore. So you're seeing some things happen, but at a sad level that relates to what's happening there, because there was so much trouble, there literally is no economic construction going on. Somebody who was a driver for me when I was there had been working in the construction trades and says there's not been a new business building built in our city for 20 years. And when all this was going on, nobody would go downtown. Everybody stayed in their own neighborhoods. It basically collapsed their economy. So they really struggle. Now, to go into the city, it looks like being in downtown Louisville. You wouldn't have a sense that there's economic trouble, but the main issues for me are that there's still this divide between the two sides. It's not so much prejudice at work as it is non-contact. But if I had anything to say to them, and again, I wouldn't do that because I don't live there, but it would be to try to do more, to just simply bring people together, not to talk about the issues, but like have dances or dinners that just bring Catholics and Protestants together. I think that might help. But the prejudice, I think, is slowly waning. But both, I have to tell you, I talk to people on both sides. Both of them will tell you that, that they understand that they're, like the rest of us, they're all liberal and open-minded, and then say, but we're right. They're wrong.
Can I add one more
Yeah,
thing?
sure.
I think that when you wait until violence occurs, the liberals have waited far too long.
Yep.
And the wilding incident that happened on the bridge and the city's reaction to that, I think is totally wrong. More cameras and more police is their solution.
Yep.
Instead of some jobs, some activities for people who live in the West.
In response to what you're saying, one quick thing and then the last question probably, but I was part of a trolley hop tour of the Parkland neighborhood a couple of weeks ago that was led by Ambassador Shabazz, the daughter of Malcolm X, who's working in our community. And it was riveting, but there were probably 4 of us on like 3 different trolley cars who were white. Basically nobody from the East End came to this, and I talked to her, and we're trying hard to see if we can repeat this, and that FOR and Interfaith Path to Peace would work to invite all of us to come, and if nothing else, see a neighborhood and see what's going on and how vibrant it is. I was really stunned by how wonderful it is. Great housing stock, people doing good things, still issues and problems, but nothing to be really afraid of. Come and visit. So watch for that. If it happens, it will probably happen Mother's Day weekend or sometime around the middle of May, but we're going to try to start doing more things that bring people together. And now one last question, but I'll stick around and answer anything else from anybody or...
Yeah,
yes.
The state of Kentucky just missed a great opportunity to reduce violence by not passing the legislation for giving people released from prison the right to vote. States that let prisoners out, whether they're on parole or not, can go ahead and register to vote, have less violence, the people participate more, the recidivism rate's lower, the same way on the death penalty. States that have the death penalty have a higher rate of violence, and in fact 3 days before an execution there's more murders in that city than at any other time during a year. So ending both of those and letting the people vote when they get out can help reduce crime and reduce violence at the same time.
Thank you for that comment. And go ahead, Chris.
I just want to share one quick thing before we close. One thing I didn't express to you all about how we do stop some of the revenge killings is through just a simple plea to, especially the young ones, that they grasp onto. Not saying all of them hold on to the words, but the simple plea is you go in a neighborhood and you say there is a common interest, and what is that common interest? They say, what is that common interest? I should go out and shoot that person that shot my friend, etc. And I usually ask them to think about one thing, and I'll point to a child that might be in the you know, in the area playing or just got off the bus or anything. And I'll tell all those young ones, I said, we got one common thing across Metro Louisville that we all agree upon. And they say, what is that? And I say, it's let the kids grow, showing compassion and saving lives. And I said, children, regardless of the tragic situation, they have always been that pillar of motivation of strength to bring us together for common causes as it relates to anger and rage and violent acts. And I said, if you want to see your little cousin grow, or your little nephew or your little niece grow, I said, you got to have, which is in you, it's a quality in you, compassion. You have to show it, and you gotta want to be about trying to save their lives instead of repeating this crazy, horrible cycle in such a repetitive way that all it does is causes more pain in families on the perpetrator side and victim side.
So, and again, we're at the end of our formal time. I'll stick around if anybody wants to talk to me. Chris, I think, has to run off.
Yeah.
But as you're leaving, if you want to be supportive of what he's doing in our community, stop and make any donation of $5 or more, take a bumper sticker, or just dump some money off. Thank you.
Thank you.